Ryan hadn't seen a single neighbor for days, but the moving trucks kept coming. Their homes, once filled with life, were now empty shells, abandoned with unsettling speed. No one seemed to care, and no one was asking questions. The government was buying up houses like they were toys, insatiable and fast. Ryan had turned down the offer to sell his house, but now he wasn't so sure if that was going to matter. The envelope on his doorstep with a government seal on it wasn't an invitation. It was a warning. Ryan woke up to the sound of his alarm, the same shrill beep that sliced through the silence of his morning routine. He reached out, slammed the snooze button, and sat up slowly. The clock read 7 a.m., a time that used to signify the start of another mundane day. But for Ryan, days had become harder to distinguish from one another. His apartment, his house, rather, was the last thing he had left in a life that had been slowly draining him of purpose. Ryan was a man of routines, of simplicity, someone who didn't need much but the basic rhythms to survive. Work, sleep, eat, repeat. That was his cycle. He kept to himself, rarely ventured out, and let life pass by like the cars speeding down the street outside. The neighborhood was quiet today, but then again, it always was. That was the way it had always been in this suburban sprawl. Houses lined up like pieces in a game, uniform and predictable. The grass was neatly trimmed, the sidewalks were clear of debris, and the leaves from the trees fluttered down only when the wind allowed. Nothing about this place ever felt chaotic. Ryan liked it that way. There was comfort in the mundane, in the simplicity of watching the world go by while keeping to the edges of it. He stumbled out of bed and headed for the bathroom, his eyes still heavy with sleep. As he washed his face, the water splashed over his hands and sent a shock of cold through his veins. It didn't wake him up, though. He was still tired, in that deep, bone-weary way that no amount of sleep ever seemed to cure. He hadn't been sleeping well lately. A quiet paranoia had begun creeping into his nights, a feeling that something was subtly shifting around him. The night had become a place of unease, not because of any vivid nightmares, but because of the quiet absence of anyone else in his neighborhood. He finished his routine, dressed in the same faded jeans and plain shirt that hung from his closet like it was part of his daily uniform. It didn't matter what he wore. It didn't matter what he did anymore. The monotony had dulled his sense of self, and the more he looked at his reflection, the less he recognized the face staring back at him. A stranger, someone whose eyes had started to blur with each passing day. If you're enjoying the tension building in this story, make sure to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Now let's dive deeper into Ryan's world. Ryan walked into the kitchen and started brewing coffee. He didn't bother with breakfast. The smell of the brewing coffee was the only thing he really noticed. Something to tether him to the waking world, something to bring him back from the fog of his thoughts. As the pot filled with the dark liquid, he stood by the counter, his hands gripping the edge, staring out the window into the stillness of the neighborhood. The moving trucks had started arriving a few days ago. It had been a slow trickle at first, a few houses here and there. But then it accelerated. One by one, families packed up and left, the vans loaded with furniture and memories. It was all so clinical, like a machine turning its gears. Ryan never saw anyone in the process of leaving, just the trucks, the boxes, the empty houses left behind. He had no idea why. The neighborhood was fine. There was nothing to suggest anything had gone wrong. And yet, no one seemed to have any interest in staying. Ryan shook his head, rubbed his eyes, and let out a deep breath. He wasn't one to overthink things. He wasn't one to question the quiet order of things. People moved. It happened. Maybe there was some new development or incentive elsewhere. Who knew? But what unsettled him was that no one, not a single person, ever explained why they were leaving. The houses weren't selling. No for sale signs were left in front of any of them. They just vanished. And then there was the letter. Ryan had seen the envelope sitting on his doorstep the previous evening, but hadn't bothered to open it. Government-issued letters weren't anything new. Tax forms, census data, mandatory town meetings. But when he picked it up this morning, he could tell something was different. It wasn't the usual white envelope. The seal was more official, darker. Something about it made his fingers twitch. He ran his thumb over it before tearing it open. The letter inside was short and to the point. Dear Mr. Ryan Callahan, the government is pleased to inform you that your home has been selected as part of a special program aimed at upgrading residential areas in your neighborhood. We have made an offer to purchase your property for a generous sum that exceeds its current market value. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to finalize the details. This is a time-sensitive matter. Please respond within 48 hours. Respectfully, a Department of the United States Government. Ryan stared at the letter for a moment, his thoughts still processing the words. The offer was almost too generous, too good to be true. But there was something more than just the offer itself that made him uneasy. The letter felt off. It felt like a summons rather than an invitation, as though he were being asked to leave, whether he liked it or not. He tossed the letter on the table and poured his coffee, his mind racing. The neighborhood's sudden exodus was hard to ignore. How many people had left already? The street had become a ghost town. No laughter echoing from backyards, no kids playing basketball in driveways, just empty houses, all the same. No new families had moved in, no replacements, nothing. Ryan sipped the coffee slowly, hoping the warmth would calm the agitation growing in his chest. The house felt too still. He could almost hear the silence settling in around him, pressing down on him like a weight. As the day unfolded before him, the unsettling feeling only grew. Why had his house been left out of the government's buyout offer? Why wasn't he part of the deal? His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his neighbor, Tom, who had been living next door for years. Hey Ryan, you get that letter? Ryan's fingers hesitated on the screen. He wasn't sure what to say. What did it mean? Why was Tom suddenly reaching out? Something in his gut told him Tom wasn't the kind of person to send a casual text about something like this. Yeah, got it this morning. Ryan replied. Don't sign it. Whatever you do, don't sign it. It's not what it seems. The message was cryptic, and Ryan's stomach dropped. He had no idea what Tom was talking about, but it was clear that whatever was happening, it wasn't ordinary. Ryan stood there for a long moment, staring at his phone, the weight of the message hanging heavy in his hands. What was Tom warning him about? And why? Ryan's gaze shifted back to the empty street outside. The trucks were gone now, but the vacant houses stood like silent witnesses to something unspeakable, something that was beginning to feel far too real. But there was one thing he was sure of. He wasn't going to be the last one left. Ryan couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him as the days dragged on. His routine, once a shield, had become a prison. The mornings were the same. He woke up, made coffee, stared out the window, checked his phone, and went to work. But each day, the world outside seemed a little more distorted, a little more unreal. He had to admit to himself, at least in the quiet of his own mind, that something was wrong. Something had shifted in his neighborhood, something he couldn't explain but felt deep down in his bones. It was the little things at first. The way people avoided eye contact, the strange looks he got when he tried to talk to his neighbors. Tom's cryptic message had hung over him, like a cloud that refused to dissipate. He'd been trying to act like it didn't bother him, but it was getting harder to pretend that the stillness around him wasn't suffocating. The houses next to his had been empty for over a week, the owners nowhere to be seen. Not a single new soul had moved in, no for sale signs stood outside. Just empty, abandoned spaces where homes once were. Ryan didn't know what was worse, the constant silence or the persistent feeling that he was being watched. There was always something lurking in the back of his mind, a whisper telling him that it was only a matter of time before the same thing would happen to him. But then, there was the letter. The government's offer, which seemed too generous to be real, had only added to his anxiety. Tom's warning still echoed in his head, each word more ominous than the last. Don't sign it, he'd said. Whatever you do, don't sign it. It wasn't like Ryan to be paranoid. He'd always been a practical man, content with keeping his head down and his life simple. But now, each time he stepped outside, the air felt thick, oppressive, like something was just beneath the surface waiting to break through. He began to notice things that he hadn't before. The way the trees in his yard didn't sway with the breeze, how the sun didn't seem to shine quite as brightly, how the streetlights flickered at odd intervals. He hadn't seen any sign of government agents since the first visit, but that didn't mean they weren't watching. He couldn't help but feel like they were always just around the corner, waiting for him to slip up. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Tom, this time even more urgent. "Ryan, you have to leave. Don't wait. It's too late for me, but it's not too late for you." Ryan stared at the screen, his heart pounding. What was happening? What had Tom gotten himself into? Tom had always been a man of few words, never one to panic. For him to send a message like this, it couldn't be good. Ryan's hands shook as he typed a response. "What's going on, Tom? What do you mean it's too late for you?" A few minutes passed before Tom replied, "I don't have much time. They've already taken everyone. Everyone who left. They're all gone. It's not what they say it is. They've been watching us for years. You're next, Ryan. Don't stay. Please, for your own good." Ryan's mind raced. The words were nonsensical, but there was a desperation in them that couldn't be ignored. What had Tom gotten mixed up in? He'd always been a bit eccentric, but this was different. Ryan looked out his window, at the rows of houses that stretched out in every direction. They all looked so normal. Too normal. It was as if they were waiting for something, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. He needed answers, but Tom's message only deepened the mystery. He had to know more. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, determined to talk to Tom in person. The air outside felt strangely still, and Ryan noticed the lack of sounds. No birds chirped, no dogs barked, and even the distant hum of traffic seemed muted. He walked down the sidewalk, his footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence. As he approached Tom's house, he felt a sudden tightness in his chest. The windows were dark, the front door locked, but there was no sign of life. It was as if Tom had vanished, leaving nothing behind. Ryan knocked on the door, his knuckles rapping against the wood with an odd finality. He waited, but no one answered. He tried the door handle. It was unlocked. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside, the air inside thick with dust. The house was empty, completely empty. There were no signs of life, no furniture, no personal belongings, nothing. The walls, once adorned with family pictures, were bare. It felt like a house that had never been lived in. Ryan's heart pounded as he walked through the silent rooms. There was no trace of Tom, no indication of where he'd gone or what had happened to him. Ryan's mind began to spin, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His fingers brushed against the empty walls, and it felt as though he were touching the last remnants of something that had once been real. Something had happened here, something that Ryan couldn't understand. It was as if Tom had simply disappeared. He left the house quickly, slamming the door behind him. His mind was reeling. Where could Tom have gone? And why was everything so empty? He needed to get answers, but he was beginning to realize that no one was going to tell him anything. No one seemed to know anything, or if they did, they weren't talking. Ryan's phone buzzed again, a message from the same unknown number. This time it wasn't from Tom. It was from the government. "Mr. Callahan, we noticed you haven't responded to our offer. Please remember, this is a time-sensitive matter. We urge you to reconsider. Failure to comply may result in unfavorable consequences." The message made Ryan's blood run cold. He had no idea how they had gotten his number, but he didn't need to be told twice. The pressure was building. The government was pushing harder now, and the sense of foreboding in his gut had only intensified. They wanted him to sell his house. They wanted him to leave. But why? And what would happen if he didn't? Ryan tried to rationalize everything. The letter, Tom's warning, the empty houses. It could all be a coincidence, right? A mass buyout, some new government project, a few strange anomalies. But then, the feeling of being watched crept up again. He looked around him, his gaze darting across the street, checking the empty houses. Was someone behind the curtains? Were the neighbors all watching him? The unease settled into his chest, a constant pressure that wouldn't release its grip. He couldn't stay here anymore. Not like this. He needed to find answers, but every step he took led him further into a maze of confusion and fear. The neighborhood was closing in on him, and the walls were starting to feel too tight. As he stood there, frozen in the middle of the street, the quiet seemed to grow louder. It was as if the world had stopped moving, as if everything was waiting for something. Ryan felt like he was on the verge of a revelation, something that would make everything clear. But the more he thought about it, the more tangled his thoughts became. One thing was certain: the government's offer was just the beginning. He hadn't signed it yet. But how long could he hold out? How long before they came for him too? Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. He had spent the past few days trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but nothing about his life felt normal anymore. The government's letters kept coming, each one more insistent than the last. They promised more money, a better deal. But there was something unsettling about the way they were written, as if there was a hidden meaning, a warning beneath the surface. Every day, his house felt smaller, the walls closing in on him as the empty homes around him seemed to grow more and more oppressive. The streets, once so familiar, now felt foreign. The silence was unbearable. He had been avoiding the windows, not wanting to look out and see yet another house boarded up, another family gone. But now he found himself staring out of the kitchen window, unable to pull his gaze away. The houses on either side of him were empty, completely empty. He didn't even know what had happened to his neighbors. It was as if they had never existed at all. There were no signs of struggle, no trace of anyone leaving, just nothing. The pressure was unbearable. The government had become a constant presence in his life, sending letters, making phone calls, leaving messages on his door. They were persistent, relentless. They wanted him to sell, to leave. They told him it was for his own good, but he didn't trust them. Something about this entire situation didn't sit right with him. He had thought about leaving, thought about just packing up and disappearing. But then there was the feeling, the sense that he was being watched, that the walls of his house were closing in on him with every passing second. Ryan's thoughts turned back to Tom. What had happened to him? Tom had warned him to leave, to get out while he still could. But Ryan hadn't listened. He couldn't. He was trapped in this place, in his own mind, trapped by the fear and the uncertainty that had become his reality. The letter from the government still lay on the table in front of him, its sealed envelope taunting him. He hadn't opened it yet, hadn't read the final offer, but he knew it would be more of the same. More promises, more pressure, more of the same ominous undertones that had been creeping into his life for weeks. But then there was something else, something Ryan hadn't expected. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence. He froze, staring at the door, wondering who it could be. It wasn't like he had visitors, not anymore. The neighborhood was empty, the houses abandoned, and yet the doorbell rang again, this time more urgently. Ryan's heart raced as he stood up from the table, his feet heavy as he walked toward the door. He didn't want to open it, didn't want to face whoever was on the other side, but something inside him told him he had no choice. He had to know. He opened the door slowly, his fingers trembling as he turned the handle. On the other side stood a man in a dark suit, his face expressionless, his eyes cold. The man didn't speak at first, just stared at Ryan with an intensity that made him feel as if he were being evaluated. It was the kind of look that made Ryan feel like he was being sized up, weighed, judged. "Mr. Callahan," the man said finally, his voice low, controlled. "We need to talk." Ryan felt a cold chill run down his spine. He knew what this was. He had known this moment was coming. The government had sent someone to speak with him, to pressure him further, to make him comply. But he didn't want to comply. He didn't want to be part of whatever was happening in this town. "About what?" Ryan asked, his voice hoarse, his throat tight with unease. "The offer," the man said simply. "You've received our letters. We've been very generous. But you haven't responded. We need to know your decision, Mr. Callahan." Ryan's gaze shifted to the letter on the table behind him, then back to the man in the doorway. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what was happening, or why the government wanted his house so badly. But he knew he couldn't trust them. He couldn't trust anyone in this neighborhood anymore. "I'm not selling," Ryan said, his voice firm, though he could feel his hands shaking. The man's eyes narrowed, but he didn't react immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, pushing past Ryan and into the house without waiting for an invitation. Ryan's stomach twisted in protest, but he didn't stop him. He couldn't bring himself to do it. The man stood in the middle of the living room, surveying the space with a clinical eye, as if assessing the value of the house beyond what was obvious. Ryan's eyes followed his every move, every step, every glance. But there was something unsettling about the way the man moved, like he wasn't really seeing the house, but something deeper, something more hidden. "We don't want to do this the hard way," the man said finally, his voice still calm, almost too calm. "But we will. You don't understand the situation you're in, Mr. Callahan. This is bigger than you, bigger than your house." Ryan's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "What's going on in this neighborhood? Where is everyone? What happened to Tom?" The man's gaze flickered just for a moment before returning to Ryan with an intensity that made him feel like he had just crossed a line he shouldn't have. "You don't need to worry about Tom," the man said, his voice cold. "You just need to make your decision. It's better for everyone if you do." Ryan took a step back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about a house. This wasn't just about money. This was something much darker, something much more sinister. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The unease that had been growing for weeks was finally bubbling to the surface, and now he was face to face with it. The government didn't want his house. They wanted something else. They wanted control. They wanted power. And they would do whatever it took to get it. "I won't sign," Ryan said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I'm not selling." The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a long, slow look around the house again, his gaze lingering on the empty rooms, the stillness that had taken over everything. Then, finally, he spoke again. "You don't have a choice, Mr. Callahan," he said. "You never did." Before Ryan could react, the man turned and walked out of the house, leaving him standing there, his heart racing. Ryan slammed the door shut behind him, his chest tight with anxiety. He felt like he was suffocating, like the walls were closing in on him faster than he could comprehend. The government was getting desperate. They were pushing harder now, more aggressively, more openly. And Ryan didn't know what to do. He didn't know who to trust, or even if he could trust himself anymore. As he stood in the silence of his empty house, the weight of the situation settled over him. The feeling that had been lurking at the back of his mind for so long. The one that had started as a whisper and now screamed louder with every passing moment, was undeniable. He wasn't going to leave. But then, Ryan knew, the choice had already been made for him. If you're enjoying this story and want to see what happens next, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the suspense as it unfolds. Also, leave a comment down below with your thoughts. Do you think Ryan will be able to escape? Or is he already too deep? Let me know what you think, and don't forget to like this video to support more thrilling content like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.